What if the Great Wall of China wasn't just a barrier to keep invaders out, but the backbone of an empire that spanned the globe? It's a fascinating thought experiment. Picture a world where the Americas weren't discovered by Columbus, but were instead a province of the Ming Dynasty. A world where European monarchs paid tribute to the Dragon Throne in Beijing, and the global language of trade and culture was Mandarin. This is the story of what might have happened if the great Ming treasure fleets never stopped sailing. The Dragon awakes, a point of divergence. To understand how this alternate world could even be possible, we have to go back to the early 15th century. At this point in history, Ming China was undeniably a global superpower, and it projected that power across the seas with a fleet the likes of which the world had rarely seen. Between 1405 and 1433, the Yongle Emperor sent out 7 epic voyages commanded by the eunuch admiral, Zheng He. This wasn't just a handful of ships. We're talking about vast armadas with hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of men. The flagships of this fleet were the legendary treasure ships. Now, their exact size is a hot topic for historians. While some Ming-era sources describe them as colossal vessels, perhaps over 400 feet long, many modern naval experts are skeptical that ships of that size were structurally possible back then. For perspective though, even more conservative estimates make Columbus's Santa Maria at around 85 feet look tiny by comparison. These were essentially floating towns outfitted with advanced compasses and watertight bulkheads. For nearly 30 years, these fleets sailed the Indian Ocean. They reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the distant shores of East Africa. Their main mission wasn't conquest, but a grand projection of power meant to bring the world into China's tributary system. They'd arrive with gifts of silk and porcelain, and in return, foreign rulers would acknowledge the supremacy of the Ming Emperor by sending back tribute and their own ambassadors. But don't mistake this for a purely peaceful mission. When they ran into pirates, they crushed them. When a kingdom in Sri Lanka was hostile, Zheng He's forces invaded, captured its king, and brought him back to China. This was diplomacy backed by an iron fist. They established a sprawling network of trade and influence that made China the undeniable centre of their known world. And then, in 1433, it all just stopped. After the Yongle Emperor's death, a new political mood swept through the Forbidden City. The powerful Confucian scholar officials, who had long been skeptical of these expensive adventures, gained the upper hand. They argued the voyages were a waste of money and that China should focus on domestic issues and the ever-present threat from the Mongols on the northern border. It's an oversimplification to say they were all uniformly isolationist, but the cost of the voyages and the very real dangers on land were powerful arguments. Eventually, imperial edicts restricted the building of large ships, and the world's greatest navy was gradually decommissioned. China turned inward. But what if it didn't? This is our point of divergence. Imagine that in the 1430s, the pro-expansionist faction, the eunuchs, the merchants, men like Zheng He, won the debate. They convinced the emperor that the wealth from trade isn't a drain, but the very key to funding the armies on the Great Wall. The decision is made. The voyages will continue and expand. The dragon, having tasted the world, refuses to go back to sleep. The first ripple: conquest of the Indian Ocean. In our new timeline, the mission of the treasure fleets changes. It's no longer enough to just visit. The new, highly ambitious goal is to control. The grand strategy: turn the Indian Ocean into a Ming lake. Achieving this would have been a monumental undertaking. The first logical move would be the full militarization of the Strait of Malacca, a key tributary state, transforming it into a permanent, fortified naval base. From this choke point, Ming fleets could project power across the entire ocean. This would present local kingdoms from the Swahili coast of Africa to the Spice Islands with a stark choice: accept a more permanent tributary status with Ming overseers or face the fleet. Local resistance would likely be met with overwhelming force. The Ming way wasn't typically wholesale slaughter. Instead, they might use their significant advantages in ship size and manpower to win short, decisive battles. They could then replace defiant rulers with compliant ones and integrate local economies into their imperial system. While Ming fleets were large and carried gunpowder weapons, it's worth noting that these weapons were spreading across Eurasia, and local naval powers in India and the Arab world were not to be underestimated. Still, if they succeeded, the profits would be staggering. By controlling the sources of spices and gems and cutting out the middlemen, wealth could flood into the Ming treasury. This income would finance an even larger navy and army, silencing the critics at court under a mountain of foreign silver. It is highly speculative to think they could have achieved absolute control by the 1450s, as the logistical and political hurdles would have been immense. But in this what if, let's say they did. The first phase of global domination is complete. A new world to the east, the Ming discovery of America. With the Indian Ocean basin pacified, an ambitious admiral, a successor to Zheng He, makes a bold proposal to the throne. For decades they've sailed west. Now, he suggests sailing east across the vast, uncharted Pacific. Funded by the wealth of their existing empire, the emperor agrees. This part of our story is pure speculation, as there is no credible historical evidence the Ming ever reached the Americas. But in our alternate history, sometime in the 1460s or 70s, decades before Columbus, a massive Ming fleet sets sail. With their sturdy ships and advanced navigation, the journey across the Pacific, while incredibly dangerous, is at least conceivable. They might make landfall somewhere on the west coast of North or South America. There they would encounter the great civilizations of the Aztecs and Incas. What follows is probably not a repeat of the brutal Spanish conquest. The Ming goal would likely be to bring these new peoples into their tributary system. They'd make a spectacular show of force, firing their cannons, what the locals might see as man-made thunder. They'd show off their steel weapons and their colossal ships. The message would be clear: we are your superiors. Then would come the offer: acknowledge the Son of Heaven in Beijing, offer tribute of those yellow and white metals you have in abundance, and in return, we will trade our silk, porcelain, and iron tools with you. Faced with a technologically superior power, the Aztec and Inca empires might have accepted this offer. Of course, the great exchange of biology still happens. Old world diseases like smallpox would still be introduced to populations with no immunity. While the script notes it's speculative, it's important to stress that modern epidemiologists would not predict a significantly better outcome. Disease-driven population collapse is devastating, regardless of who initiates contact. Over the next century, this alternate America is transformed into a vast and wealthy Ming territory. It's a purely conjectural image. Confucian academies built near Aztec pyramids, Chinese bureaucracy managing tribute, and rice paddies terraced into the Andes. Most importantly, the rivers of American silver and gold would flow west across the Pacific, straight to China, preventing the fiscal crises that plagued the real Ming Dynasty, and funding the next stage of its global expansion. The dragon at Europe's door. While the Ming are building a trans-Pacific empire, a very different Europe is emerging from the Middle Ages. The Renaissance is in full swing, but their world is about to feel a lot smaller. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sails west, but he doesn't find a new world. He might stumble upon the eastern edge of a vast Chinese economic sphere, perhaps Chinese trading posts in the Caribbean. His discovery would be the shocking revelation that Europe is on the distant periphery of a world whose center lies elsewhere. In this scenario, the European age of discovery could be severely curtailed. The flood of American gold and silver that funded the rise of the Spanish and British empires never arrives in Europe. It's all going to China. Without that fuel, the engine of European colonial expansion would sputter. The inevitable confrontation might come in the early 16th century. Having long ago secured naval bases in Africa, Ming fleets could round the Cape of Good Hope and appear in the Atlantic. Imagine their colossal ships sailing into the Mediterranean, casting long shadows over the galleys of Venice. The naval mismatch would have been stark. While claims in some sources of Ming ships having thousands of cannons are exaggerations, their size and firepower would have been deeply intimidating to early 16th century European navies. Portugal, Spain, and the Italian city-states would be outclassed. Again, the Ming probably wouldn't seek to occupy and rule Europe directly. It's too far, too fractured, and too poor. Instead, they would impose their system. European nations would be forced to become tributaries, sending wool, timber, and art to Beijing in exchange for the right to buy Chinese goods. Europe wouldn't be colonized, just humbled. It would become a secondary player on a world stage dominated by Ming China. The focus of global power wouldn't shift to the Atlantic. It would remain firmly centered on the Pacific. The world the Ming built. A Sino-centric globe. So what would an alternate 21st century look like in this world? Geopolitically, the world might be stable under a single imperial authority centered in Beijing. Mandarin would likely be the language of global diplomacy and commerce. The great conflicts might not be between nations, but between the Ming imperial core and its various tributary zones, constantly testing the limits of their submission. Technologically, the world would be advanced, but innovation's heart would be in the East. With centuries of global tribute, the Industrial Revolution might have begun in the Yangtze River Delta, not Manchester. Chinese engineering and astronomy, already highly advanced in the 15th century, would have continued their trajectory. Culturally, the planet is vastly different. The brutal transatlantic slave trade as we knew it wouldn't have happened, though the Ming Empire would have surely relied on its own forms of imperial labor. The Americas would be a blend of indigenous and Chinese cultures. Europe would be a different place too. While it's unlikely the Renaissance would have been just a regional affair, its cultural roots were deep and complex. Europe's global influence would have been drastically reduced without the wealth from colonialism. And the Ming Dynasty itself? In our timeline, it collapsed in 1644 due to rebellion, fiscal crisis, and Manchu invasion. It's tempting to say that in this alternate history, the dynasty never falls. But even with the wealth of a planet, no dynasty is immune to internal decay or rebellion. Ruling a global empire for over 1,000 years would have been a challenge of unimaginable proportions. From the Indian Ocean to the Americas, the single decision to keep the treasure fleets sailing after 1433 could have rerouted the river of human history. It would have created a world so different from our own as to be almost unrecognizable, a truly global empire, centuries ahead of its time, under the banner of the dragon. But what do you think? Would a Ming-dominated world have been a better one? More stable, perhaps, without the scars of European colonialism? Or would it have just been a different brand of empire, with its own forms of oppression? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy exploring history's biggest what-ifs, make sure to like and subscribe for more alternate histories.